Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to, what is today? Oh, it's Thursday. Oh, all right. That's pretty good. Tomorrow's Friday. Then there's a weekend. Not bad, right? Not bad. Um, let's see. What should we talk about? Is there anything that we should talk about or that we should know, Anna? We're all good? David? About anything?
About anything?
Yeah.
I have no idea. What topic do you interest right now?
What topic? Hey, good morning, Mir. What topic am I interested in right now? Let's see. I am interested in where all my students are. I'm also somewhat interested. Oh my gosh, here they all are. All I had to do was like wish for it, and they just like almost literally fell out of the sky. Wow. That doesn't happen very often. What else can I wish for? $1 million, please.
No.
Not enough? No? $1 million really isn't worth what it used to be, you know? Like, when I was a kid, like, if you were a millionaire, it was like, oh, right? Now, if you have $1 million, it's like, it's not that big a deal, right? That's what a house costs in Vancouver. Maybe I need to be like a 10 millionaire, if that's not a thing, but speaking of 10 millionaires, what do you guys want to do like after high school? What do you want to go into? Anna?
Psychology.
Cool. Very cool. Are you going to go across the street and do it?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah? Yeah, that's cool. You'll enjoy that. And then maybe like as a profession, like counseling or psychology or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Maybe? That's really cool. My fiance is a counselor. She's a teacher, but she just got her master's in counseling. So she's now a real counselor with clients and everything, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that's neat. David, what do you want to do? What do you want to be when you grow up?
You want to grow up?
What?
When I grow up?
When you grow up, yes.
Have no 1 million?
Do you what?
With no 1 million?
No, well, you can have the 1 million if you want. It's this is your dream future, so whatever you want.
Maybe influence?
You want to influence people
Yeah.
as an influencer?
Yeah.
What do you want to influence them on, like fashion or health or?
Yeah, very fashion.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, there's money to be made, right? That 20 years ago that wasn't a real job, but today it kind of is. All right. Mir, what do you want to do?
Either psychology or business.
Lots of psychologists in the room. Again, you could be a counselor and you could have your own business, so you could do both.
I don't want to be a counselor. I just want to have that information.
Oh, okay.
Psychology in my head, but I want to do business as a.
Okay. Okay. The human brain is fascinating. As is business, though. Business is kind of interesting too. And business is kind of like, in a way, like business can be anything you want it to, right? Because, like, if you own a business or if you run one, you could have any type of business you can imagine, right? So there's, how to run a business and how that works, but then you could be dealing in anything, right? Okay. Cool. Abby, what about you?
I'm not sure yet.
Not sure yet? If I said right now you have to pick your future in 10 seconds.
Probably something in business.
Something in business? Yeah? What is it? Maybe I'll ask Mir and Abby, what is it that what makes business so kind of interesting or attractive to you?
Just because like you have your own thing.
Right. Like the ability to kind of like to sort of be your own boss kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you?
You can make like, actually, like whatever passions you have, you can make like a business to do with them. As long as you know that knowledge, like if you want to be an influencer as a trainer, a fitness trainer, you can sell that. Well, you know your business and you know your body knowledge well. You know.
That is pretty cool, right? Yeah, it can be anything, right? Even if you want to make like the best longboards out there, that can be your business, right? If you know how. Yeah, that's cool. Nobody wants to be a teacher? No? I haven't inspired you to.
Like, or maybe in your class, I would be like Hitler, the Hitler said it in the future.
You could no. That's no, that you're going the wrong way. I want you to be the opposite of that.
Opposite?
Yes. We're learning about these characters so that you can do the opposite. So that you can. Maybe that's the problem with this history class. Maybe we're focusing too much on the bad guys and not enough on the good guys.
I'm joking.
That's always more interesting.
Well, in some ways they really are, right? The person who does everything right and is good, it's like, boring, right?
There's too many people.
Well, maybe that would be a good topic for like a final project, right? Like we've, in the 20th century, we've got Stalin, we've got Hitler, we've got Mussolini, we've got Lenin, but who are the good guys?
Batman.
Not fictional. Yeah, Batman's a little, he's a little in a gray area too. Sometimes. Is anyone going to see that new Batman?
Yeah, new Batman. Yeah.
New Batman? Is it?
I tend to watch it Saturday.
You're going to see it this Saturday?
Yeah.
Okay, on Monday, let us know how it is. I'm curious.
Yeah.
It kind
Like, I think it's got like so many like good reviews about that.
Yeah. It's interesting too because it's as it over the last like 20 or 30 years, Batman's kind of becoming like more and more realistic, right? They're trying to make it less like a fantasy and more like if you actually wanted to do this, like what would it look like, right? And so the costume seems to be getting more like something someone could actually build, and the car is like something that someone could actually build, and yeah, which is kind of interesting. Okay, ready to go? Okay, let's start. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to History 12. Yesterday, you'll probably remember that we were. Is it okay that my feet are up? Does this doesn't transmit the wrong message? That like I just, it's not like I just don't care anymore, and I'm gonna put my feet up. I'm very much here. We talked about Joseph Stalin, right? And we said that he's a pretty important historical figure. He doesn't really, it's Vladimir Lenin that, instigates the Russian Revolution and brings communism to Russia. But again, Lenin's going to die really quick, and it's going to be Stalin that makes it into the superpower that it becomes, right? It's Stalin's Soviet Union that's going to fight World War II. It's Stalin's Soviet Union that's going to kind of kick off the Cold War, and it's going to set the pattern for what the Soviet Union kind of looks like and how it works. He's going to be the model for that, right? So again, Lenin has an important role to play in this story, but it's really in this part of history, it's really Stalin's story of the Soviet Union, right? We were talking yesterday about some of his, what I titled some of his greatest hits, right? Which is a few interesting points from his history with the Soviet Union. We said that he attempted to collectivize agriculture, and unlike Lenin, who is trying to sort of get the peasants into it, Stalin he's the iron fist, right? And so the peasants are going to accept collectivization, they're going to accept socialism, or they're going to go to a slave labor camp, right? And so anybody who kind of opposes this process is shipped off to one of these camps. The kulaks, right, the people who are the slightly richer farmers, the ones who had made some money under the new economic policy, there's no room for them anymore either. They don't exist in a socialist system, and so they get shipped off as well, right? And so lots of people kind of vanish, right? They either leave the countryside, they starve to death, they die, or they're sent to a labor camp, right? And it's, you know, it's maybe important to reflect on actually how, you know, the Soviet Union is going to become an industrial power in a very short length of time. But it's interesting to think about how much of that work is done by slave labor, right? In terms of mining and raw material extraction and timber and stuff like that. Those people aren't working because they want to, right? They are prisoners. They are political prisoners who are enslaved by the Soviet Union, right? We said that he sets the first of these 5-year plans, which will become kind of an institution in the Soviet Union. And as you can see here, he's asking for huge increases in industry, right? And again, these kinds of numbers are just not realistic, right? Nobody increases their industrial production by 300% in 5 years, except Stalin, right? So these numbers would be totally bananas, except for the fact that he actually does it, right? But we also said that in some ways, Soviet industry is kind of weaker than Western industry. And so they kind of get up to speed really quick, right? They become an industrial power very quickly, but their technology is kind of lags behind, right? Their manufacturing quality, not as good, right? And so there's kind of, yes, they can produce all of the things that Western countries can produce, but their stuff is just not quite as good, right? Again, we said he collectivized agriculture here. The kulaks are liquidated, they are removed. Lots of people did die or go to labor camps. And yeah, there's a lot of text here, but basically Stalin does in 12 years what takes probably 20 or 30 years in countries like the UK or countries like Great Britain or France, right? So when France and Great Britain, when they industrialized, first they had to get all those people who were farming, and they had to kind of bring them into the cities because they needed a labor force, right? So they had to pass a bunch of laws to kind of encourage people to, you know, abandon their farms, come into the cities and get factory jobs. And they had to build factories, and there was a lot of kind of work that had to be done, but it took place over several decades, right? The government definitely pushed people to get them to do it, but it took a long time. But here, Stalin is going to achieve the same results in, you know, a fraction of the time, right? In 12 years. So Russia becomes a less rural, a less agricultural country. It becomes a more industrial country. Cities start to grow really quickly. Industrial targets are being hit. And again, he's wildly successful. But again, their industrialization is not quite as good as the Western countries are. Their technology isn't as good. And even though he's collectivized agriculture, it hasn't really solved the food shortage problem. The Soviet Union still cannot produce enough food to feed its people. And again, that's a problem that, well, I mean, if we're looking at 1937, that's a problem that's 40 or 50 years old by this time, right? Food shortages have been around for a long time. And the czars didn't manage to fix it, and Lenin didn't manage to fix it. And to be honest, Stalin's not going to manage to fix it either, right? They're not going to be able to have enough food for their people. Now, yesterday, I asked you to read this section of the textbook on what happens in Ukraine in 1932 and 33. And so, can I give you just a few minutes to look that section over again? Because I wanted to answer, hey Ryan, I wanted to answer the questions at the end, but I know we've probably forgotten a little bit about it. So I'm just going to put maybe 5 minutes on the clock. I'll let you review that page or so that we read, and then we'll talk about the 4 questions at the end, okay? So it's page 80, 81, 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about what's happened here, okay? Maybe just one more minute or so. Okay, people. So here we have just a short little case study of one particular event in the history of the Soviet Union and in the history of Ukraine, right? Which, of course, is something that is very connected to today's events, right? So the first question here is that the case study documents two famines or two instances where there wasn't enough food to go around in Ukraine. One in 1921 and 22, one in 32 and 33. Now, what's the difference between these two events? Avi, what's the difference between these two?
So the first one was compared to the Holocaust.
The first one was?
Yeah.
It looks at no, because that's the 32-33 one, right? That's the second one.
Oh yeah, the second one.
Yeah, the second one's compared to the Holocaust, right? And why was that?
Because it was
Okay.
Oh, could you just give me a minute?
I can give you a minute. What's the deal, Anna, with the first famine? Why does it come about?
It was acknowledged by the Soviet government.
Okay, it was acknowledged by the Soviet government. Okay, we know that. Good. Mir, what else do we know about that earlier famine, 1921-22? Yeah.
The shift in popularization from rural to urban areas.
Okay. There was a shift. Sorry, where does it say that?
The second paragraph, industrialization and reduced
Okay. Okay. So I think that's kind of a background detail to what's happening here, right? So in the Soviet Union in general, people are starting to move from the countryside into the cities to get factory jobs, right? And that's an important part of industrialization. You need a workforce. You need people to work in the factories. So that's kind of a background detail. Avi, I'm coming back to you.
Okay, so from the one in 1932,
Uh-huh.
it was acknowledged by the Soviet Union and it organized massive domestic and international relief to alleviate the hunger experience in Ukraine.
So that's the first one or the second one?
The first one.
The first one? Yeah, because why did the first one come about? Why was there such a shortage of food, or why was the harvest so small? David, help me out here. Why was the harvest so small in 1921-22? No idea.
There's no agriculture being done by workers.
No, not quite. Not quite. What's kind of happening here in this first part in 1921 and 22 is that, remember, that's just shortly after Lenin takes over, right? So the Russian Revolution is in 1917, and for the first few years, Lenin is trying to get the peasants to do communism, right? He's trying to get them to work on big collective farms and give their harvest to the state so the state can give them what they need. But of course, we've talked about the fact that the peasants they're not really into that. They don't really want to do that. And so they resist. They don't turn over their harvest. They sell their food on the black market. And so as a result, there's kind of a shortage of food to go around, right? And they also mentioned there's a bit of a drought. What's a drought?
When you can't grow food,
Because there's no
water.
Yeah, there's no water, there's no rain, right? It's too dry. And so Lenin is trying to get the peasants to sort of hand over the harvest, a la socialism. The peasants aren't doing it, they're not cooperating, and they have a drought that year, and it results in a food shortage, right? But we see that the Soviet government acknowledges it. They accept foreign aid to try to, feed the people. But in 1932-33, it's kind of a different story, right? First of all, there's no drought. But why is there a shortage of food? Why is there a shortage of food? Why is there a shortage of food? It's actually the first line of the first paragraph. What does it say there?
Well, the Soviet Union took the
Yeah, right? Systematic confiscation. So the Soviets actually took the grain, pardon me, they took the grain from the Ukrainian farmers, right? They rounded it all up and they sent it back to the Soviet Union to feed the workers in the cities, right? We said that Stalin was prioritizing industrialization, right? Industrialization was more important than agriculture. He took the harvest, sent it to Soviet cities to feed the factory workers. And for the Ukrainians in Ukraine, what did he do? Well, he sealed the border, right? He made the theft of grain punishable by death, right? He made it so that the Ukrainians couldn't sell any of their heirlooms. They couldn't sell any of their things in order to buy food, right? They were given an 80-kilogram bag of grain that was supposed to last a family of 5 all year. I didn't do the math on this, but does that sound like enough? No, right? That does not sound like enough. And so basically these people were locked in their country and left to starve, right? Stalin took their harvest, locked the door behind him, and left these people to starve. And starve they did, right? There's some numbers in here suggesting that 17 people died every minute during that year, right? Somewhere in the order of 6 to 10 million people starved to death, right? And again, numbers are fuzzy, right? Because records aren't perfectly kept 100 years ago or so, but that's a lot of people, right? Do you remember how many people Hitler killed as part of the Holocaust? How many Jewish people? It's kind of a small detail. Well, it's a big detail. 400,000? You're a little light. you're a little light. It's probably in the neighborhood of between 5 and 7 million. So Hitler killed 5 to 7 million Jewish people during the Holocaust. Here, Stalin manages that in about a year, right? And again, Hitler, it took Hitler 5 or 6 years to do it. But Stalin manages to kill at least that many people in a single year, simply by confiscating the food and making it so that the Ukrainians can't access food any other way. They can't work any other way. They can't sell their own property to get grain. They can't steal it unless they want to be executed. And these people die, right? They starve. Here's a good question for you. Why do you think Western governments ignored what was happening in the Soviet Union? Why didn't they help? They helped in 1921 and 22, right? They sent foreign aid was sent to the Soviet Union to help the farmers, but 1932, 1933, nobody helps. Why not? Why does nobody help? I don't know, why does nobody help? Right? They were kind of willfully blind to it, right? They really wanted not to see it, right? We heard about who's this writer here, a New York Times writer, Walter Duranty, right? Walter actually went to the Soviet Union and wrote about it and got a Pulitzer Prize for his writing, right? He went there, but of course, the Soviet leaders toured him through, farms that were all working well. They toured him through a couple of villages that they sort of kept looking nice, right, to convince him that everything was fine. But it seems like even he knew deep down that he wasn't being shown the real thing, right? He was being shown a facade, right? What he was being shown was fake, right? He knew that millions of people were dying, but he wrote something different anyway, right? He said, "Oh, the Soviet Union is great, and the food is excellent, and the peasants seem happy, and how wonderful," right? But again, he was in Disneyland, right? They were taking him to something that was set up specifically to convince him that everything was okay. But in fact, the Ukrainian peasants were dying at a rate of 17 people per minute, right? That's like 50 or 60 people since we started talking about this, right? It's a lot of death, right? And then we saw that the Soviet Union was actually admitted to the League of Nations that year, right? After all of this. Why do people do nothing? Why do people do nothing? Sure, that's a really good thought, right? Is that where are we in history? We're just prior to World War II, right? Hitler is gaining power in Germany, and I think in 1933 is when he becomes Führer, right? And we know that the other Western powers, Britain and France, they kind of don't want to see this stuff, right? They're busy with their own economic problems. They don't want to get involved in another war. And so they're appeasing Hitler, right? They're like, okay, he wants to take Czechoslovakia, fine, right? Just give him what he wants, so maybe he'll be quiet and won't cause any more problems, right? So they're in the process of appeasing Hitler, and so are they gonna start to squeeze Joseph Stalin? No, right? If they're not going to pay attention to Hitler, they're definitely not paying attention to what's going on in Soviet Union. Do you think Joseph Stalin asked for foreign aid? No, he didn't ask for it either, right? And keep in mind that not only that, he was actually exporting grain, right? They didn't have enough grain to feed their own people, and he's exporting it. He's selling off grain on the foreign market. Why would he do that? He doesn't have enough food at home, but somehow he's selling it to the rest of the world. Does that make any sense? Why is he doing that?
Show that everything is okay.
Yeah. Yeah, to show that everything is okay. You'll see this a couple more times, but communism always has to be seen as working. Okay? And so communist parties, and this is not just in the Soviet Union, but communist parties will go to great lengths to try to pretend that their communism is working. Here in the Soviet Union, it's not working, right? There's still not enough food to feed the people. But to the world, Stalin is saying, communism is wonderful and it's great and everyone is well taken care of, right? And he tours these writers through specially orchestrated villages that look like everything's great, right? And he's exporting grain to the world market because, oh, we have so much, right? But we don't have so much, right? We don't actually have enough. But he's trying to convince everybody that this works, that this system works, right? And again, he's not the only Soviet leader that will do that. Others will continue to export things to the world market, even though they don't really have it to export. They're actually short of it. And they do better to keep it for themselves and then buy more if they needed it. But they sell it to make themselves look like the country is flourishing, even though it's not, right? Okay, so that's a good thought. Why? Yeah, so European leaders aren't interested in seeing what's going on. They don't want to get into a conflict. Stalin is certainly not asking for any foreign aid, nor is he admitting what's happening, right? He's saying that everything is just great, right? I'd like to ask you this last question, but I think we'll take a little break first, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about question 5, okay? So let's take a little break, and then we'll come back. Okay, and we're back. So we're talking about this Ukrainian famine, right? Or we can call it something else. This is an interesting question to ask, right? Because this is, in a way, this is the same question that we tried to find the answer to a little earlier in the term when we read that article about Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, right? And remember, we figured out the argument of that article, right? And the sorry, I'm just going to scroll back and find where it is. Yeah, there it is. The conclusion of that article was this, right? That Canada needs to firmly oppose Russia's aggression toward Ukraine, right? That was, Avi, I think you came up with the conclusion to that argument, right? When we read that article, yeah. And so this is actually the same question, right? Is that when do we intervene in countries that are doing something bad, right? Here they frame it as terrorism, which we'll talk about in a second, but I'm very curious about your thoughts. How do we figure out when to stick our nose in the business of other countries? And when should we stay out of it? When it's going to affect your country?
Yeah.
Okay, so don't take this the wrong way, but we use the selfish approach, right? If it doesn't affect me, I'm not doing anything about it.
No, or your allies.
Or my allies. Okay, so we could look at if whatever that country's doing, country X, let's say, if country X isn't doing anything bad that affects me or my allies, then it's none of my business.
Yeah.
Okay? David, what do you think? When should we intervene? When should we get involved in other countries if we think they're doing something bad? How should we make that decision? Avi's just given us one set of criteria, right? Does it affect me or my allies? Yes? Okay, we're going to do something about this. No, it doesn't affect us? I'm not doing anything. Right? That's one set of criteria for making that decision. But what are other criteria that we could use to make that decision? Mir, what do you think? Okay, so we kind of look at how it affects us and our allies. Okay. Ryan, what do you think? Same thing?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Anna? Same thing. Huh. Are you guys just saying same thing because it's easier? Or do you actually agree?
We actually do.
Actually agree?
Like we do like negotiation.
Okay. Well, that's the thing, right? And there's the other thing is that there are levels of intervention, right? We can, probably the easiest thing to do is say we don't agree, right? And we'll often hear governments do that, right? The government of Canada, condemns the actions of country X and, says that there should be a peaceful resolution, right? So sometimes the government will just say something, but they won't actually do anything. So, yeah, we could say things, we could try to negotiate with them, right? We could try to encourage them to do the right thing, or we could start actually taking real action, right? And we've definitely seen that with Russia and Ukraine so far, right? Lots of countries have put in economic sanctions. They've cut Russia off from banks and financial services and Olympic Games and all kinds of things, right? Okay. So same thing. So you just look at if it affects you or your allies, and then, but what about all of these dead Ukrainians? Don't we feel bad about these 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million dead Ukrainians? Don't we feel bad, or are they just not our problem?
We do, but
But,
It's Russia.
okay, what does that mean?
You gotta think twice before you
You,
fight.
you got to think twice. Why is that?
Because they're powerful, they're strong.
Sure, right? So I guess, one of the criteria might be, although it might be in the back of our mind, but how much is this going to cost us, right? If it's a small, weak country, then, maybe we can twist their arm pretty easily and it wouldn't cost us really very much at all, right? It would be easy to do. But with a big country, with a lot of people and a military and nuclear weapons, maybe we've got to think twice, right? It's going to be much more difficult to twist Vladimir Putin's arm than maybe, I don't know, a smaller, poorer, less well-armed country, right? So that's part of it. But still, what about all these dead Ukrainians? Don't we have a responsibility to them? Do we have more of a responsibility, right? Avi has said that, you got to think twice because Russia is a powerful country, and Avi's right. That's an important consideration. But also, doesn't that make us more responsible because the countries that the Soviet Union or that Russia might oppress, maybe they can't defend themselves against the Soviet Union?
No, but like you could put pressure on the countries that are in the same continent
Okay.
as Russia.
Oh, okay. So we could try to, like, we could lean on Germany, let's say, and say, hey, Germany, you've really got to deal with this. Get in there. Get in there and deal with it, right? We're going to stand over here, but you get in there and deal with it.
Yeah,
Okay?
but it's their continent.
It's their continent. Okay. Yeah, and you've mentioned this before, too, that continents seem to be an important kind of barrier for you, right? It's not on your continent. It's not your business, right? Okay. Yeah, but what about all these dead Ukrainians? Don't we feel bad for these people? What's their crime? Living next door to the Soviet Union? It's not really their fault. Or actually being absorbed by it. Not wanting to go along with a government that they didn't elect. That government just seized power at the end of a rifle barrel. Now they're telling people what to do. I don't know. Again, this is a decision for you to make. I'm not trying to push you one way or the well. I'm trying to push you to think about it. I'm not trying to push you in one direction or another. But still, ethically speaking, don't we? What about all these dead Ukrainians? It's interesting what they say at the end of this. This is where language is important. Okay, this is an important thing to look at. Now, because often we don't really pay attention to our language, right? We think that the words we use aren't important, right? But look what they say in question 5. They say this: should the Canadian government intervene in the affairs of countries who are guilty of acts of terrorism against their own people? Is this terrorism? Think back to V for Vendetta. V was a terrorist, right? Again, we sympathized with him, right? We kind of saw him as the hero of the story, but he was still a terrorist. Is what the Soviet government is doing here, is this terrorism?
Isn't this like a genocide?
Well, I was hoping that you might suggest that. Is it a genocide? We've seen this before, right? We said that the UN, although in 1932-33, genocide really wasn't invented yet, right? The UN hadn't actually created this definition. But still, the UN said that if you systematically harm or kill members of a certain group, if you impose living conditions on them that is intended to bring about their destruction, if you prevent the births of new people of a group, or if you forcibly transfer children out of that group, if If you do any of those things, you're guilty of genocide. Do any of those fit with what's happening here in the Ukraine in 1932-33? Which one?
The first one.
First one, they're systematically harming or killing them? Well, I think we saw that in other parts, but in this particular instance, are we not seeing that? Are we not seeing number 2? They're imposing living conditions that will destroy them, right? If you seal the borders of a country and you remove all their food, you're imposing a living condition in which they will starve to death. And they do, right? Millions and millions of them do. So, might this not be an act of terrorism, but actually an act of genocide, right? Might this not be a famine, as the book says, because a famine kind of implies that the crop failed, right? It was too dry or too wet, or there were pests, right? There were locusts or something, or massive flooding or whatever it was, and the crop failed. And then there's not enough food and it's a famine, right? But is this really a famine? Is it a famine when someone takes all of your food and makes it so that you can't access any others? No, right? I don't think that's the right word for what's happened here, right? And I don't think that terrorism is either. I don't think this isn't a terrorist act, right? Terrorist act are somebody who uses terror or violence for a political purpose. And again, the Soviet Union has definitely been guilty of using terror against its citizens, and Stalin, for sure, is guilty of that. But I don't think this is terror either. I think this is a genocide. And so now, the international community, right, the Britain and France and the US and others who were around in 1933, not only did they turn away and not look at a genocide that was happening, but they actually kind of rewarded the Soviet Union, right? They gave them entrance into the League of Nations that very next year, right? People like Walter Duranty wrote articles for the New York Times and said, wow, everything's so great in the Soviet Union, there's so much food, I had a great time, thanks to my hosts, that was wonderful. And people are reading this stuff, right? Not knowing that millions of people are starving to death, right? And eating their dogs just to try to stay alive, which is, yikes, awful, right? So again, there's two things here, right? Language is important, right? A famine is like, oh, the crop failed, that's horrible. But a genocide is different, right? And genocides don't happen, they're not acts of God, right? They're acts of man. They're acts of, in this case, one man. And the international community kind of turned their back, right? And so, again, I'm going to take it back to you, Abby, for a second, because you kind of, rightly, by accident or by not, you kind of set up the criteria here. But does the criteria still hold if it's genocide? Do we still have, if we look and we know a genocide is happening, do we still use the same criteria and say, well, is it affecting my people? Yeah, maybe not. Okay, it's your, I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to deal with it. Hey, what are your thoughts on genocide?
Genocide. My thoughts on genocide are that we need a clear definition of this word because it's causing a problem.
I got it right here. Right out of the UN.
Acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part. There's the important one. A national ethic. Do you know what? There are philosophers in Canada who I've read who say, oh, no, we can't use the word genocide with the indigenous people. It's totally different. It wasn't mechanized. It wasn't like the Jews in Europe. And yet...
Did we talk about that in here or in this class or in social justice?
Both.
Both?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so what is a genocide? So in the minds of some people, in the minds of some philosophers, a genocide is strictly is narrowly defined as an attempt to totally wipe out a population, right? Totally wipe out, in other words, to remove their gene pool. However, look here, in whole or in part, okay? Systematic killing or harming of members, deliberately imposing living conditions to seek to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This is what's important in part. So when someone argues, okay, this wasn't the mechanized version that the Germans used, killing hundreds and thousands of Jews as month by month. However, it was mechanized in the sense that the purpose was to kill the Indian in the child. You've read that, I think, haven't you? Okay, that was
Yes.
the policy, to kill the Indian in the child. That sounds like genocide to me. In other words, we will allow their genes to proliferate, but we will not allow their culture to proliferate. They could no longer be who they were. So that's the argument I would make.
Yes.
So that, in other words, what we have done to our indigenous people, I believe, is a genocide. Now, I've heard people try to whitewash it a little bit by saying cultural genocide, or this. I think it doesn't matter. It was unacceptable, it was horrible. I've heard people say, the Canadian government, okay, so what they were doing, they were trying to do the right thing, and really they were bumbling and inefficient, and that's why it happened. Whereas the Germans, when they committed the genocide against the Jews, it was very deliberate. To me, this is irrelevant. Evil is evil.
Now, well, this is good because I have a second question for you.
Yep.
Now, let's say we're dealing with a genocide happening in another country, say in Ukraine.
Okay.
What do you think our responsibility is to intervene? Like, how do we decide whether we should or shouldn't intervene?
Okay.
I just dragged this poor man off the street, and now I'm like firing questions at him.
No, these are good questions,
Okay.
right? Okay, my feeling is this. How much worse do we make it if we intervene physically? Okay, so we know that Vladimir Putin made some veiled reference to the fact that he has nuclear weapons. In other words, if we go toe-to-toe with NATO troops in Ukraine, which I think we should do, there's enough of this garbage. If we do, there is a chance that someone will launch a nuclear weapon. If that happens, it can do nothing but get worse. Okay? So what do? We are supplying them with as much as we can. My idea is that the Canadian government, we're already giving lethal aid, which is important. Make sure the Ukrainians are armed, give them the most advanced stuff. Make sure that they have surface-to-air missiles so that when a Russian jet goes over, they can knock it out of the sky. Make it expensive and bloody. Now, something that the Ukrainians have done, which is brilliant, is they've said basically, Russian soldiers on our territory, if you come to us and you say the word million, we will give you 40,000 rubles and we will make you a Ukrainian, put down your weapons, you join our side, or you just do what you want. This is really, really smart. But what can we do? If we go in there directly, then we're directly at war with Russia, which everyone has been wanting to avoid. What should we do? We send in secret services and kill Vladimir Putin. Or capture him and bring him back and put him on trial. Right? Do you see what I mean? So I have no realistic solutions. I think that we're doing everything that we can. I think hitting them with the economic sanctions will work, but we have to remember that as we do that, Putin and the oligarchs are not suffering, the Russian people are suffering. So what we're doing with our strategy now is we're trying to get the Russian people to rise up against their own government. Okay, whether we admit it or not, we are trying to incite revolution in Russia, also a dangerous thing to do. I don't know.
Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
I don't know. Did he?
It's not a very satisfying answer, is it?
Yeah, well, we were talking about the idea that there's, when trying to decide this, and we haven't really gotten to the sort of moral or ethical idea, but, there's, you do want to weigh the costs to yourself, right? Because there's, we came up with the idea that, if you're choosing whether or not to intervene, you definitely have to look at how it's going to affect you and your own people, right? Are we going to, is this going to get a little messy for us as well if we intervene? you know, the country that we're dealing with also has a lot to do with it, right? If it's a small, poorly armed country, well, we can, you know, twist their arm pretty easily and it's okay. But Russia's a difficult country in which to twist their arm, right? And as we're reading about in the Ukrainian famine or genocide of 1932 or 33, a lot of European countries weren't really in, you know, either the position or the mood to start twisting the arm of Russia or of Germany. And so they kind of looked away and pretended it wasn't happening, right? But
we
it's
actively supported Nazis. Members of our own government here in Canada actively supported Nazism. They wanted it here.
because yeah, we've talked about the idea that anti-Semitism was not strange
It
at the
was
time.
mainstream.
Yeah, lots of people held that prejudice. It wasn't just Hitler and his upper circle, right?
Have you talked about the interesting irony? The interesting irony being that Zelensky is a Jew.
As
Putin calls the Ukrainian government fascist, that they are like Hitler. And Zelensky could be nothing further from that.
That's true. Putin has said he is attempting to denazify the Ukraine, while at the same time Ukraine has a democratic government, but also one that's headed by a Jewish man. So that seems like a very strange thing to try to believe. But
I think that, so maybe my answer is this: keep the pressure up on Russia, because Putin is an old man. Pretty soon people are going to get very, very tired of what's happening to Russia now. And we are suffering. You can see our gas prices going up. Our banking system.
they were so low before.
They were so low before. We will pay, as our deputy prime minister told us a few days ago, the sanctions that we're putting on Russia will cost us. This is not good for Canadian business. However, it's something that we can do, which is non-violent, right? And what I think that we could hope, however, is the Ukrainians, they're not new to this, and they have been preparing for 8 years for war. They have followed the classic manual. They put up no resistance when the Russian entered. They put up a little resistance and then they disappeared. And now they're striking from the outside. If Vladimir Putin decides to stay in the Ukraine, it's going to be long and protracted and expensive, and it will be like Afghanistan again. It will be impossible for him to win.
I think one of the questions, and you can comment on this if you want, Tom, but one of the questions I'd like to keep open for the next week or so in this class is like, if a foreign country is kind of behaving badly, like let's say the Soviet Union was here in 1932, or maybe Russia today, how do we decide how far are we prepared to go, right? So it's kind of the follow-up question to what we were talking about, right? Is like, when do we intervene, right? But if we're going to intervene, if we're going to do something, how far are we prepared to go? Because we'll see when we, tomorrow and early part of next week, we'll see how initially the Americans and other allies after World War II attempt to kind of contain the Soviet Union, right? And there's a huge cost to do that. And at the time, people, especially the U.S., was very willing to make those sacrifices. But I do wonder today, are we prepared to do the same thing?
Well,
are we prepared to sacrifice?
Well, there are ironies. I mean, you could see the United States following the slippery slope argument, thinking if we let Vietnam become communist, then pretty soon all of the other nations in Asia will become communist and it will spread. Likely that would not have happened. But the irony is, look at this. What the United States did in Vietnam is what Russia is doing to Ukraine right now. And this is why, if we were students of history, you can't draw direct comparisons throughout history, but I can tell you that this campaign is going to be expensive and terrifying for the Russians. Americans were terrified of the Vietnamese during that war because their fighting back was so effective, and all they got was military aid from China and Russia. Maybe that's enough to give military aid to Ukraine. As I said, some countries right now are actually talking about lending their air force jets, supersonic jets. And if they do that, then it's going to be very, very hard for Russia to do anything. So what do? We wait it out. How long was this going on in Vietnam? Well, probably from the late 50s until 1973 or 74, almost 20 years. It could be 20 years before we see any change. Right? So what do? We keep supporting Ukraine no matter what happens. With time, it will turn around and come back. Something that I want to tell you is Putin and the people like him cannot win in the long run. They will not win in the long run. However, they can do enormous damage right now. They are doing enormous damage right now. But the Ukrainians, wow, this idea. Russian soldiers, just put down your weapon, say the word billion, we'll give you 40,000 rubles, you become a Ukrainian and you're one of us. That's smart. Because most of those Russian boys, they're 19 years old, they're conscripts, you know what this means, conscript? They did not volunteer. They didn't join the army as professionals. They were taken. They were told that they must join the army. So this is a military force that could easily be demoralized, and it's happening.
Which actually is another point we've talked about too, is you know, when you're a country, you always have to tell yourself a story about who you are, right? And the type of story that is, you know, can help sustain people in a time like this, right? And so right now, Ukraine has a really good story, right? Their story is that they're an independent, democratic nation. They have won their freedom from the Soviet Union, and they're not going back, right? They're going to remain independent to the end, right? And that's a very kind of heroic story, and it's very easy for, I think, the Ukrainians to kind of get behind. But for Russia, it's much more complicated because Russia is kind of the aggressor here, right? They've kind of started it, but also their story is kind of confusing because the world is saying one thing, which you can very easily read on Twitter and social media, and then the Russian government is saying something totally different. And the story is very muddy, right, about what Russia is trying to do. And so for Russian citizens, and especially for Russian soldiers, they really need the story to inspire them, right? They really need to know what they're fighting for. And I think if the Russians look around, it's not quite obvious what they're trying to do, right? It's hard for them to be inspired based on what the story is, right? But for the Ukrainians, they have a very compelling story. And so they've kind of chosen certain elements from their history, like we've talked about. They've created a story, and that story unites them, right? And helps them to do the very difficult work of repelling another country. But I'm not sure that the Russians have done such a good job building a story that everybody can get behind. And so that's how we've talked about that, you know, history is, you know, it's a story, and it's chosen from certain people and events, and it's crafted for an audience to do a certain thing. And for the Ukrainians, their story is working for them. And for the Russians, I think it's a murky, confusing story.
Have these students seen the Ukrainian men's choir singing for the opening of the hockey game in Calgary?
Oh, of course. No, we haven't seen that.
There was that one. There was another one that comes from a couple of days ago, the Metropolitan Opera in New York, probably the biggest and most famous opera company in the world. We're doing a production of Don Carlo. That is not important what that means. But they got out there, all of them, chorus members and leads, so about 30 opera singers singing the national anthem of Ukraine before they started. So the propaganda is working very, very well. Nobody can see that without being moved. Right? In fact, when I saw that, I gave $50. I'm cheap. If something makes me give up $50 to a charity, you can tell it's good. So,
I'll sing the Ukrainian national anthem for $50. No, I'm just kidding.
will you do it as well as the Metropolitan?
Doubtful. Highly doubtful. Highly doubtful.
Another thing to keep in mind is I've been noticing, luckily there's something that we're nipping in the bud. Do you guys know this expression, nip in the bud? When a flower is just beginning to start, you cut there so it cannot bloom. So nip in the bud means to prevent something, to stop it before it happens.
So you're not nipping it in the butt. That's not the right.
No,
Okay.
no, not at the moment.
Okay.
Nipping it in the bud. What's happening is some people will conflate the idea of Putin's aggression with Russians. Now, I know that it's just how we are, right? It's easier to think of the Russian people as one big block of people who are represented by this guy, Putin. In Vancouver, there is a Russian restaurant called the Russian Spoon, I think, and they put something on social media saying, look, we are in support of the Ukraine. Right? We're Russians, but please understand that we're not the bad guys. We're not with Putin. Because they have been receiving a lot of really negative comments from people going, oh, this is a Russian restaurant, they must be bad. Right now, I have a Russian student in one of my classes. And nothing has come of this, but I think of this a lot, and I think, I have to be very careful if I talk about this at all, never to use the word Russia, but to use the word Vladimir Putin. Luckily, I'm teaching Composition 11, so politics is not a part of my class. But think of it, right? She is Russian, she identifies as Russian, there's another Russian-speaking girl in the class who is a Kazakh, so she doesn't have to identify with the Russians, right? So, I think, so we're noticing social media, they're getting this idea. There's a YouTube channel of a Russian cook that I often watch. I'm interested in her recipes. She put out a video the other day saying, look, this is not an easy video to make. I'm a cook. I don't do this. I don't talk about politics, but please understand, we came from the Soviet Union, my family. We were treated generously here. Please understand that we Russians are not Vladimir Putin. If we can keep that in mind, then we'll retain some balance. Because it's so easy. If you look at propaganda, Western propaganda from World War II, you will see the most disgusting caricatures of Germans and Japanese that you have ever seen in your life. Really, really nasty stuff. Because the thinking then was, if we're going to send our boys over there to kill Japanese or Germans, we better make sure that we view these people as something less than human. We have to view them as vicious monsters, and that will make it easier to kill them. I think that was misguided thinking. You can understand why they thought that way, to motivate the soldiers to go, but I think that we can't do that. Because if we do that, then we'll become like the other side of them. What are we fighting for? Because we're the same.
But I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that's connected to another thing we just talked about where, language is important, right? And so, here we were just talking about, this famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 33, but I'm not sure if you all agreed, but famine might not be the right word, right? When the Soviet Union confiscates all the grain and closes the borders and lets people starve, I'm not sure that famine is the right word, and maybe the G word up there is in fact the right word, right? But when we call something a famine, or when we call something an act of terrorism, we're kind of making a statement about what we believe, right? We're kind of saying how we interpret this event, right? And so,
when I was your age, the teacher referred to the famine as an engineered famine. And that was the way they explained it.
Fancy.
Did they use that term?
I feel like it's familiar. I'm not sure if they did, but I mean, you could call it that, but I mean, does that simply, like you said, does that simply whitewash what was done here, right? Does it make it sound better if it's an engineered famine rather than Stalin locked these people in a big room and just left them to die, right? That feels,
feels like a genocide.
A genocide or that feels a lot different than engineered famine, right? Engineered famine sounds sophisticated and, you know, kind of not as bad.
Yeah, it's like
right?
to say terminate with extreme prejudice.
Yeah. How about, you know, how about systematic murder, right? That sounds even worse, right?
Yeah.
But the choice of our words is important, right? Because it not only tells people what happened, but it's an argument, right? Like we've talked about before. When you say this was the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 33, you're kind of making an argument, right? You're kind of saying, this is what I believe happened. I believe this was a famine, right? If you're calling it what the Ukrainians call it, if you call it Holodomor, or if you call it the Ukrainian genocide, you're making a different argument, right? You're saying, this is what I believe this event is. This is what I think it signifies, right? So, yeah, the language is kind of connected to propaganda, but it's also very important how we speak about things, because even just saying what it is, genocide or famine, whether you're trying to or not, you're making an argument and you're potentially convincing other people as to what this is as well, right? And so, yeah, the language is important, right?
Now I think you can understand why studying a class like this is important for any field you go into. Let's say that you go into business and marketing and advertising. Studying a class like this is going to make you very, very effective. Right? You will know how to poke right there in the heart. Which, in advertising for business, is not evil. It's smart, right?
Indeed.
I'm sort of taking up your class.
That's okay. I think that was kind of fun.
It's nice to see you guys.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful, interesting class. I wish I could take it.
And yeah, I'm sorry for just hauling you in and, like, you know, subjecting you to all
Oh,
of these.
I was just being useless anyhow. After last night's meeting, I'm just walking around like a zombie now, trying to like.
It's kind of fried a few brain cells, didn't it?
We had a 4.5-hour meeting last night. So when your teachers are not nice to you today, you'll understand why.
Hey, I've been nice. Have I not been nice? Have I not been nice? No, I'm just kidding.
Teacher can ask a question. No, you can't.
No.
Can I go to the bathroom? No, you can't.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
See you.
I have a question. What do you call it? Like the president of Ukraine and his politician?
What do I think about him?
Yeah, because I feel like his ability to lead the country.
You think his ability to lead the country is
Yeah.
so-so? You know, I don't know. Feel free to jump in anytime. I didn't honestly know very much about him prior to this whole thing starting. Man, he seems to be doing a heck of a good job now. So, I mean, whatever his backstory is, or his previous experience, or what he did or didn't do last week or last month or last year, man, he seems to be doing a great job at the moment. That's all I can say. Again, I didn't really know too much about him prior to maybe about a month ago. But yeah, I think, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, I think he was supposed to be like Ukraine president for like an unrealistic reason.
He was elected for an unrealistic reason?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like
What do you mean unrealistic?
people like Ukraine, I think they voting just because they don't like the other.
Sure. Sure, and that's, it's interesting. So maybe they elected him because they just really didn't like the other candidate, which is possible, right? And it's a flaw of democracy. It's what the fascists in Italy were talking about, right? They were complaining about democracy because they said you give power to the people, and then the people don't know any better, and they make bad decisions, right? That's why you can't give people the power, right? That was Mussolini and his fascists. That's what they believed, right? And And it's true, it's a danger of democracy. If your people aren't well informed or well educated, or if they don't think critically or rationally, then yeah, they're going to make stupid decisions. And when they do, the country will suffer as a result, right, from those stupid decisions. Again, I don't think Zelensky's doing a good job at the moment. I mean, he seems to be, you know,
Like, don't waste that much.
He-
Russia try to do it.
yeah, well, but he's, you know, he's in the process of becoming a national hero, right? Which is definitely more than I can say for many Canadians over the past 50 or 60 years. We don't have too many of those. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he got elected for the wrong reasons. Maybe his background is not great, but I don't know. I can't seem to argue with what he's doing at the moment. He'll be, if things keep going this way, he'll be a national hero in Ukraine. Whether they win or lose, he'll be a big deal. I guarantee you Justin Trudeau won't be. Sorry, Justin. Okay, I think that's about all the time we have. Tomorrow, when we come back, I've got some things for you to read. We basically brought ourselves up right to where we left off, right? So we started with World War I. We finished World War I. We went through the story of Germany and World War II, and then we put that on pause. We jumped back, and we looked at the Russian Revolution. And now we're kind of right back at the place where we left off. Second World War has finished, and the Cold War will kind of begin. So that's where we'll pick up tomorrow, and we'll move forward from there to the end. And there'll be lots to talk about with Russia because they're a big part of, well, the Soviet Union's a big part of the Cold War, of course. Okay, that is all for today, my friends. I hope you enjoyed our guest star. Wow. Have a good afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow for Friday, okay? All right.